Well, many people have questions about what comes next following the Pope's death. Questions like, when will the funeral be? How is the conclave process set? And how is it set up? What's happening next? Our Mark Carcasol here with us to answer some of those questions. Mark, so what can you tell us?
And Natalie, this is a process that has played out hundreds of times over thousands of years for the Vatican. They literally have a playbook for how this is supposed to go. That's 400 pages long that details every aspect from the day of a reigning Pope's death until the succession of a new one. Every bit of language that needs to be used, every procedure that occurs, every service, every policy is all detailed in that. There's also a 20-page document that details the whole procedure of electing a successor. Now, it all starts today, day one, and that's when the papal chamberlain temporarily takes the lead of the church, confirming Pope's death. And in this case, the death of Pope Francis has already been confirmed by Chamberlain Cardinal Kevin Farrell. The Pope will then be dressed in his white and red funeral garments and laid in a coffin. That expected to happen later today in Vatican City. We move on to day two of the process tomorrow, where the College of Cardinals has its first meeting to plan out funeral and succession processes that will begin almost immediately. They'll also plan to take the Pope's body to St. Peter's to eventually lie in state as part of a 9-day period of mourning that begins today. Now, from there, they move on to the actual funeral itself, which is expected to occur within a brief period of time. Anytime between Friday and Sunday is when it could happen. He will lie in state at St. Peter's Basilica for 3 days, but he will be at ground level, not on an elevated platform as previous popes. And that sort of plays into what we've heard about Pope Francis during his reign, the way he sort of scaled back on a lot of the pomp and circumstance and extravagance of the role of the Pope. The Pope, for example, used to be buried in 3 interlocking coffins made of various materials. One of the things he did was ensure that when his time would come, he would be buried in a simple wooden coffin. He also wants to be buried outside the Vatican grounds at the Basilica of St. Mary. Just again, one of several things that the Pope asked for in documents leading to his passing away, of a more simple way of being mourned. Let's hear more from Catherine Clifford. She's a theology professor at St. Paul's University in Minnesota, who details some of the other ways.
I think it's a very intentional effort to reset the image of the papacy and to give a much humbler image of the Pope or the Bishop of Rome as there's a traditional expression, the servant of the servants of God. Really, he understands his ministry as being at the service of others, and he has took from the beginning of his pontificate some very deliberate efforts to distance himself from the imperial style of the past.
So earlier I mentioned that his funeral service is expected to be either Friday or Sunday. That sort of falls in line with the procedure where it's supposed to occur 4 to 6 days after a pope's passing. Mentioned that typically the Pope is buried at the Vatican. He wants to be buried outside the Vatican at the Basilica of St. Mary, where other popes in the past have been buried. Now, while that was his request, and for it to be done, quote, with no particular decoration, just the inscription Franciscus, his papal name in Latin, we don't know necessarily whether that will be granted. We do know that the Vatican has the final say as to where a pope is buried. Pope John Paul II, for instance, wanted to be buried in his native Poland, but that request was actually turned down by the Vatican, and he was buried within the Vatican grounds, as tradition goes. Once that funeral is done, we move on to the conclave and the selection of the new pope, and that will see 120 cardinals taking part. They must be younger than the age of 80, and it begins 15 to 20 days after the Pope's death. Once that conclave begins, cardinals are essentially sequestered. They can have no communication with the outside world until the election process is completed. The voting occurs in the Sistine Chapel with a day of voting, 4 days of voting. They take a break on day 5 for a day of prayer, and then they go back to voting again until one of the candidates receives 2/3 majority. Then we know, of course, about the stoves and the burning smoke that comes out of them. If you see white smoke, it means that a new pope has been chosen. Black smoke, that means no successful election has been made.
So much more to come on this. Thank you, Mark. That's the CBC's Mark Carcasol. Well, for more on what is to come, I want to bring in Kurt Martins now. He is a professor of canon law at the Catholic University of America. Kurt, thank you for joining us.
You're welcome. Thank you for having me.
Let's get to it, because what can we expect from the church in the coming days, particularly in this time between the Pope's death and the election of a successor?
Well, actually, we're going in overdrive. You'll see a lot of activity. First of all, focused on say goodbye to a shepherd. So we'll go into the funeral rites and whatnot. And then we're going into the conclave, second element of this sede vacante. So tomorrow at the first general congregation, you'll see a few first decisions come out, such as the time and date of the transfer of the Pope's body to St. Peter's Basilica, but also setting the time for the funeral. And the funeral will then kick off the 9 days of mourning, the novendiales. And then they probably also will set sooner rather than later the date for the beginning of the conclave. And so that are a number of decisions that we should expect very soon.
And as we watch for that, I want to speak to you about the funeral just for a moment. How will the Pope be honored and reflected on during this funeral?
Well, there is obviously time for personal reflection. However, the funeral rites, although Pope Francis has modified them a little bit a few months ago, these funeral rites have been the same for a while. So there's going to be a funeral mass presided over by the Dean of the College of Cardinals. All the cardinals will be concelebrants. You'll see heads of state and whatnot. The only thing that's simplified is that the Pope wants to be buried in 2, not 3 caskets. And one change that was confirmed by the last will that just was released is that the Pope wants to be buried in the Basilica of St. Mary Major, so not in St. Peter's Basilica. So that is what to be expected. He wants it to be simple, not a big funeral monument, as we know from Baroque popes and popes from the Renaissance, but just a simple monument, a stone with only his name on, Francis.
Let's talk about sort of the location of where Pope Francis wishes to be buried, because unlike previous popes, he will not, as you mentioned, or does not wish at this point to be buried in St. Peter's Basilica. Tell us a little bit about the Basilica where he wishes to be buried.
So first of all, while we are used to popes being buried in St. Peter's Basilica, it's not a must. So the Pope can freely decide on his funeral place where he wants to be buried. There are already a number of popes buried in St. Mary Major, so he wouldn't be the first one. But that place was close to his heart, because that was where he came to pray before every trip. After every trip, he came to venerate the image of Our Lady that's there in one of the side chapels. And that's where he wants to be buried, close to where that venerated image of Our Lady is present. So it's a personal significance for him.
We know it will be up to the College of Cardinals to vote for his successor, who will be the next pope. But as you mentioned, there's so many different elements that we have to get through before we get to there. So I'm just curious how long it might take for them to make their decision at this point.
That's an excellent question, because there are a number of unknowns here. First of all, we have 135 cardinal electors, provided they all come, that nobody is sick or whatever. So 135, that's the biggest number of electors we've had in the history of the papacy. You need to have a 2/3 majority to be elected. And the cardinals do not know each other. The cardinals know each other. Some are better known than others because of the positions they've held. But it's going to be quite interesting to see how much politicking has been done beforehand in terms of seizing the moment and in terms of getting a new pope out and about. But a 2/3 majority is a big majority. It's not a simple majority. So that means that super conservatives or super progressives are unlikely to be elected. It's someone who needs to be a middleman, somewhere in the middle of the center, to be able to attract all those votes. How long that's going to take, that's unpredictable. It could go fast, like in the last 100 years, a few days. Maybe it will take longer. Time will tell. I think the coming days with the general congregations are going to be important, because that's when the cardinals get to know each other, can talk, especially those who don't know each other yet. They will be able to talk, to speak up, and the others are going to look at them, and they might make an impression or not. And so that's how that thing works, obviously, partially.
Well, Kurt, we appreciate your time and, of course, your perspective and knowledge here. Thank you so much. Kurt Martens is with the Catholic University of America. Well, the Vatican has published the Spiritual Testament written by Pope Francis. It's dated June 29th, 2022. In it, the pontiff writes this. Take a look. As I sense the approaching twilight of my earthly life, and with firm hope in eternal life, I wish to set out my final wishes solely regarding the place of my burial. Throughout my life and during my ministry as a priest and bishop, I have always entrusted myself to the Mother of our Lord, the Blessed Virgin Mary. For this reason, I ask my mortal remains rest awaiting the day of resurrection in the Papal Basilica of St. Mary Major. I wish my final earthly journey to this end precisely in this ancient Marian sanctuary, where I would always stop to pray at the beginning and end of every apostolic journey, confidently entrusting my intentions to the Immaculate Mother and giving thanks for her gentle and maternal care. I ask that my tomb be prepared in the burial niche in the side aisle between the Pauline Chapel, Chapel of the Salus Populi Romani, and the Sforza Chapel of the Basilica, as shown in the attached plan. The tomb should be in the ground, simple, without particular ornamentation, bearing only the inscription Franciscus. The cost of preparing the burial will be covered by a sum provided by a benefactor, which I have arranged to be transferred to the Papal Basilica of St. Mary Major. May the Lord grant a fitting reward to all those who have loved me and who continue to pray for me. The suffering that has marked the final part of my life, I offer to the Lord for peace in the world and for fraternity among peoples.